God is Not Great by Christopher Hitchens, book review, part 3. Yeah, part 3. Sorry about this. Part 1 ended because my camera has a 30-minute time limit and won't film any videos longer than 30 minutes. On part 2, my battery died. So part 2 was only about 15 minutes instead of 30 minutes. And then at that point, I just went to sleep last night and let the battery recharge over the night. So here I am on part 3 the next day, and I have a lot to say on this book, and I apologize because I'm not sure how coherent I'm being, but I'm trying to get through all my opinions on this. But this will be the last video. Wherever the video cuts out after 30 minutes, wherever I am in my ramblings, I'm just going to call it good there. And if you want to see my full thoughts on this book, I'll link to my original book review on my blog from 2012 in the description down below. But I'm just going to see how far I get, and then wherever I end at the end of 30 minutes is where I end. When the battery died last time, I was talking about an example in Numbers of the Old Testament barbarity that Christopher Hitchens had borrowed from Thomas Paine. And with apologies, I think I'd like to shift slightly maybe. I'm going to put that example on hold. We'll come back to it if there's time. I want to talk briefly about Thomas Paine because this was one of the other main points I wanted to get to. Christopher Hitchens, in his book, borrows from Thomas Paine a couple of times, acknowledges Thomas Paine a couple of times. If memory serves, one was the example in Numbers that I just gave, and the other was Thomas Paine's writing on how Moses couldn't possibly have written the Pentateuch because there's so much internal evidence that it was written by somebody other than Moses, and Christopher Hitchens references this briefly. In the YouTube debates that Christopher Hitchens was famous for, he also referenced Thomas Paine very frequently. Now Thomas Paine, if anybody out there doesn't know, maybe a non-American, for example, Thomas Paine is regarded as one of America's founding fathers. He's maybe a little bit of a borderline case because he wasn't actually at the Constitutional Convention and he didn't actually help write the Constitution or ratify any of the articles or, write the Declaration of Independence or anything like that. But he was definitely one of the spirits behind the American Revolution, and he's regarded as the pin man behind the American Revolution. So usually regarded as one of America's founding fathers, an all-around very interesting guy, if anyone has the time to read up on him. He was also an ardent deist. Now, this is interesting because in America, because it's such predominantly a Christian nation nowadays, we've created this myth that it was always a very strong Christian nation. But a number of the founding fathers were actually deists. Thomas Jefferson, I believe James Madison, double check James Madison, but definitely Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Paine are prominent examples of this. And they were skeptics of the Bible. They believed that no reasonable person could believe the stories in the Bible. But they were deists, meaning they believed that there was a God. So there was some all-powerful, omnipotent God up there in the sky somewhere, but they just believed that the Bible stories themselves were actually ridiculous. And Thomas Paine wrote a whole book articulating this view, arguing why there is a God, but also why no reasonable person could ever believe the ridiculous stories in the Bible. Christopher Hitchens references it a couple of times, and so after reading Christopher Hitchens, I tracked down a copy of Thomas Paine's book online, which is called The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, which I highly recommend and which I will review in an upcoming video at some point. I'm working my way through all my old reviews here on this YouTube channel. That one's coming at some point, but I guess the point I want to make for the purposes of this video is when I read The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine, I realized exactly how much Christopher Hitchens has borrowed from Thomas Paine. Now, even though Christopher Hitchens does credit Thomas Paine frequently, and he does reference him frequently, I think he borrows more heavily from Thomas Paine than he acknowledges, even with all his references. There's even more stuff that's borrowed from Thomas Paine. So, here's a list of things that I noted that Thomas Paine had said first that I often associate with Christopher Hitchens. In refuting the idea of Christ dying to redeem humanity, Hitchens often used to talk about how monetary debts can be paid by someone else, but a moral debt can never be assumed by another person. Thomas Paine made this point first. Hitchens, in his debates, was fond of pointing to the example of the dead rising out of their graves. This comes from the Gospel of Matthew. It says when Jesus was crucified, the temple curtain ripped in half, and all the saints came out of their graves and walked around and talked to people that they knew. Hitchens often says in debates, did this happen or didn't it? If it didn't happen, what's it doing in the Bible? If it did happen, where's the evidence for this? How come no other writer besides Matthew mentions all these people getting out of their graves? I mean, you would think this would have caught the attention of first century Jewish historian Josephus, but it didn't catch his attention. It didn't catch any of the Roman historians. It didn't even catch the attention of any of the other gospel writers or authors of the Bible. It's only in the Gospel of Matthew. Turns out again, even though this was one of Christopher Hitchens' favorite points, this comes from Thomas Paine, who goes on about this for some time in his own book, about how ridiculous that story is. Hitchens often used to say that miracles cannot prove religion, because if you think a miracle is happening, you have to ask yourself, is this really a miracle, or are my senses deceiving me? And even less so, miracles that are reported to you by other people cannot possibly be counted as proof of religion, because now you're just kind of putting your faith in the contents of what you're putting your faith in somebody else's credibility, and that really shouldn't be regarded as a proof of religion. This was again something which Thomas Paine wrote at length about in his book. Christopher Hitchens liked to say that religion combines mankind's strange appearance of humility with its boldest presumptions. Again, turns out this originally came from Thomas Paine. Christopher Hitchens talks about how we cannot receive the Bible on its own authority, and he compares it with other writings which are self-evident. Like Euclid's geometry, which contain the proofs for what it wants to say within the writing. And he compares this to religious writings, which which are not self-evident examples of their own proof, and instead rely on some sort of mysterious belief in divine inspiration for their truth content, and that belief in divine inspiration has to come from outside of the book. This again comes from Thomas Paine, who makes the same point in the same comparison with Euclid's geometry. Christopher Hitchens liked to talk about how Christians had misinterpreted Isaiah's prophecy to King Ahaz about the virgin giving birth. Christians take this as meaning a prophecy for Jesus, but the Jews do not, because in the context of the story, it's clear that Isaiah is telling King Ahaz about something that would happen in his own time. And also the Hebrew word here, which later got translated as virgin, just means young woman. Again, this comes from Thomas Paine. So quite a number of Christopher Hitchens' best points. And I'm referring here, I guess, as much to his debates on YouTube as to his book. But his best points, a lot of the points we associate with Christopher Hitchens, came from Thomas Paine first. And if you look at Christopher Hitchens' bibliography, he published a book on Thomas Paine right about the same time that his book on religion came out. So I highly suspect that he was going back and he was either reading or rereading Thomas Paine, The Age of Reason. And he thought, oh, this is good stuff. I should write this up myself, market it as my own book and sell it and stuff like that. And this gets back to maybe, again, something that could be considered a bit of a low blow perhaps, but the allegation that was made by several people that Christopher Hitchens was an opportunist, first and foremost. And this is an allegation that was first made of him with his support of the Iraq War, and then with his strange kind of pivot back to outraging the conservatives with his anti-religion book. I guess the theory would go that Christopher Hitchens saw how popular Dawkins was getting with this anti-theistic thing. Thought maybe he saw something in the wind and decided to jump on the bandwagon himself. Not that I don't think Christopher Hitchens ever changed his opinion. I think he was always an atheist. But he may have seen that there was money to be made in emphasizing atheism once Dawkins and some of the other people started to get popular. And then perhaps realized that nobody was reading Thomas Paine these days, and these arguments were just there for the grabbing. That's a cynical view, admittedly, and I'm not even entirely sure I believe it myself. I'm just throwing it out there. Now, does any of this matter? Arguably not, because people aren't reading Thomas Paine nowadays. I don't know. Let me know what your experience is. But I have not seen Thomas Paine in a bookstore. When I decided I wanted to actually read Thomas Paine, because he's been dead for 200 years, all his stuff is in the public domain. So you can find it free on websites and stuff like Gutenberg and stuff like that. And that's where I found it. But I think very few people are tracking it down online. It certainly did not get all the publicity and the fanfare that Christopher Hitchens got when this book came out in 2007. So if nobody is reading Thomas Paine, and Thomas Paine made some really good arguments, then maybe it's for the best that Christopher Hitchens has rescued some of these arguments from obscurity. And maybe it's fair game to update them for a new generation. Possibly in the best of all worlds, Christopher Hitchens would have acknowledged more fully his debt to Thomas Paine, but it's really a minor point. I don't know. I'm thinking out loud. I'm proposing maybe here that perhaps Christopher Hitchens has borrowed a lot from Thomas Paine, but maybe it's all fair enough. I don't know. What do you think? I guess, did Christopher Hitchens borrow more than he acknowledged from Thomas Paine? If so, does it matter, or is it just fair enough that he's updated this for a new generation? And just out of curiosity, what is your experience with Thomas Paine's book, The Age of Reason? Have you read it? Have you heard anybody talking about it? Have you seen it prominently displayed in bookstores? I have not. I'm going to leave it there because I will come back to talk about Thomas Paine's The Age of Reason at some point, and hopefully the not too distant future, in a separate book review. I'm going to, let me maybe touch on one more point here before I get into some of the tangents I want to go off on. I've already broached the topic of Christopher Hitchens being an opportunist, and having brought that up, maybe share the last thing that makes me a bit uncomfortable about this book or about his whole rhetoric. And that is, and again, I'm referring as much to his debates as in his print book, the idea that religion was the ultimate evil for everything. Or as it's put in his subtitle, how religion poisons everything. Now, if you've watched Christopher Hitchens in debates and on videos, you know that when people ask him about this, he frequently shifts the blame to his publishers. I guess authors don't often choose the title of this book. This is what the publishers wanted on the book. But then he said, having been given this title by the publishers, he thought it was kind of a challenge to live up to it, and he wanted to try and argue the idea that, yes, religion actually does poison everything. Which it indicates maybe that this whole thing is a little bit of a game to him, a little bit of an intellectual exercise, for whatever that might signify. But having accepted that challenge, he does take the line in his book, and I think in his debates, that religion is the ultimate evil for everything. My own view, and I say this again as somebody who has left the church and become a skeptic over the years, but I think it's oversimplifying to say that religion is always a source for evil, or it's always something that is disadvantageous. And I think the problem with saying something is always bad is you're almost ascribing some sort of, I mean the whole idea of good and evil, as it's frequently thought about in religion, that there's some sort of outside good force and there's outside evil force that are personified in some ways by divine beings. That's a religious idea. And if you are going to say that religion is always something that is bad or evil, you're almost taking that religious idea of evil and transposing it onto this debate. Or in other words, I think it takes just as much faith to believe in the devil as it does to believe in God, if that analogy makes sense. You can't say just something is always going to be evil. If religion is something that humans have created, for whatever reason, whatever biological or Darwinian reason we feel driven to do this, I think the logical conclusion is that there are going to be some benefits to it and some drawbacks to it, just like everything else that's man-made. To say that it's always going to be evil or it's always going to result in detrimental effects is almost like ascribing some sort of intelligence to it, or hopefully you get what I'm saying here. Anything kind of human created is going to have good and bad effects. And I think any reasonable person looking at either the history of religion or looking at religion's effect in the present day is not going to have to go far before they see some very bad effects of religion and some very good effects of religion. Now, those good effects do not by any means mean it's absolutely true. I mean, just because the Catholic workers are going out and doing some good work with the poor does not mean that Jesus rose after 3 days and that there's a heaven up above us or anything like that. But I think it would. I think it's needless. It's needless to try and argue that everything that the Catholic Church does is evil, or that every time religion gets involved in something, it is going to have a detrimental effect. So that would be, I guess, my other main criticism of this whole enterprise. Okay, for whatever remaining time I have left, I'd like to get maybe into some of the points in Christopher Hitchens' book and just talk about my own reactions to them. And this is going to be about as much about my own views as it is in the book, because there are a number of points in the book where Christopher Hitchens touches on something, and I think he's got a good point, but he doesn't develop it all. He doesn't develop it at all because he's too busy rushing off to articulate his next point. To be fair, I think that's a style that he has deliberately chosen. He wants to get through as many things as possible, and he wants to kind of keep this breakneck pace going through the book. And to a large extent, I think it does work for him. As I said at the beginning, way back in part 1, I did find this book incredibly addictive as I was reading it. It's something that really keeps you turning the pages like, oh wow, oh wow, oh wow. Even though he does get so much wrong, which is disturbing that he gets so much wrong, his style does work, at least in terms of readability. But let me go back now and try and expand on some of the points which I thought he made that were interesting or possibly could be expanded on more. And I'm just going to go as long as I can until I get to the end of 30 minutes, and then the camera is going to cut off, and I'm just going to cut it out there. He had a very interesting section, Christopher Hitchens, on Noah's flood, which was on page 103 to 104 of the book. And I want to read this here. He says, "The folk memory, now confirmed by archaeology, makes it seem highly probable that huge inundations occurred when the Black Sea and the Mediterranean were formed, and that these forbidding and terrifying events continued to impress the storytellers of Mesopotamia and elsewhere. Every year, Christian fundamentalists renew their expedition to Mount Arafat in modern Turkey, convinced that one day they will discover the wreckage of Noah's Ark. This effort is futile, and it would prove nothing even if it were successful. But if these people should chance to read the reconstructions of what really did happen, they would find themselves confronted with something far more memorable than the banal account of Noah's flood. A sudden massive wall of dark water roaring across a thickly populated plain. This Atlantis event would have adhered to the prehistoric memory all right, as indeed it does to ours." Sorry, I should have done a better job of setting that up. But what he's referring to is that the flood narrative occurs in a lot of Near Eastern mythology, which indicates something. Either they're borrowing the narratives from each other, or there was actually some big flood in early Mesopotamia, which made a huge impact on the memories of our prehistoric ancestors. And Hitchens is toying with the latter idea. And I find his description of this just absolutely fascinating. I read this and it really excited my imagination. Imagining this huge flood just kind of wiping out this civilization, and something that scarred it, the memory into the memory of those peoples long afterwards. And it fascinated me so much that I went to Wikipedia to read up more on this. But Wikipedia's account of this is a lot more skeptical than Hitchens. And I mean skeptical in the sense that they're skeptical that there was this great flood that actually occurred in Mesopotamia that was the origin for all these myths. They do mention that on Wikipedia. But it sounds like this is one of many competing theories for where these flood myths came from. Christopher Hitchens, when he recounts it in language, as I just read, that was very authoritative. The reconstructions of what really did happen. He talks about that as if this was something that if the Christians would only bother to look into it, they would find the evidence of what really happened. But actually, what really happened is a lot more murky. Doesn't mean the Christians are right, of course, in their own mythology, but it means Christopher Hitchens shouldn't have presented it like that, as if the question had already been solved. At any rate, I thought it was something that was interesting to ponder. Want to move back to something else I mentioned in a previous video, which is how scholars today believe that the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were actually not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Now, this is something that I said in the previous video that Christopher Hitchens only mentions in passing, does not bother to talk about the scholarship behind it. But for what it's worth on this, he's right. This is what the scholars believe. And this includes Christian scholars. Again, I went to a conservative Christian school and went to a conservative Christian small college that was associated with the Christian Reformed Church, Calvin College. And the professors there in the religion department taught us what is common across any Protestant mainline school in America or any mainstream university. Yeah, which is that the Gospels were not written by the apostles. And this was quite a shock to me, because this was different than everything I had learned in church, everything I had learned in Sunday school, and everything I had learned in Bible class in my private Christian schools up until this point. And the incongruity of this has always struck me as a bit strange, because I thought to myself, if I learn this in an introductory course to the Bible as an 18-year-old freshman, my pastor definitely knows this. You know, he went through 4 years of seminary. He knows more than I do about the scholarship. He knows that the Gospels were not written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and yet every Sunday we talk about, Matthew's Gospel, or, all these myths about, these legends about how the Gospel of Mark is actually Peter's testimony that was written down by the scribe Mark, and so it contains all the Peter's confessions about why Peter is feeling bad about stuff. I absorbed this stuff in Sunday school and church, and it was given to me by people who must have known that wasn't true. Because what they're teaching in seminaries is that there's overwhelming evidence that they couldn't possibly have been written by the apostles. I suppose I better talk briefly about what that overwhelming evidence is, or I'm going to be guilty of the same sin as Christopher Hitchens, which is to just say something and expect people to believe it. Of course, don't believe me. Research this yourself. Check what the scholars are saying about this, but there's a number of different reasons. One is that the Gospels are all written in highly literary Greek, and of course the apostles were illiterate. John and Peter couldn't read or write. This is told to us explicitly in Acts. Also, there is the synoptic problem I mentioned in the first video, where we know that Matthew and Luke were copying from the Gospel of John, Matthew and Luke were copying from the Gospel of Mark just because of the internal evidence within the Gospels, the fact that they're word for word the same, and that it appears Matthew and Luke are taking Mark as their base source and adjusting it. And if Matthew was an eyewitness, then why is he copying from John Mark, who wasn't even there? And then there are the facts that the original documents, the earliest church documents, do not connect these Gospels with the names of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This seems to have been a later tradition. There are facts that these Gospels seem to have come from a later period and are reading conflicts that came from a later period between the Jews and the Christians back into the Gospels. There's a whole bunch of reasons why even conservative Christians, the scholars at any rate, acknowledge that the Gospels weren't written. And this is actually true for a lot of the Bible. There were 7 undisputed letters of Paul that scholars believe Paul actually wrote, but there are 6 that he didn't write, possibly, or definitely 3 that he didn't write. The letters, the epistles of John, the epistle of John may have been written by John the Elder, but not John the Apostle. Okay, forget about the epistles of John. Epistles of Peter, the epistle of Jude, were not actually written by the historical Peter and Jude. And then if you want to get into the Old Testament, there's all those problematic things there. On the one hand, it's maybe a minor point, especially if you're a Protestant. You say, okay, well, as a Protestant, I'm not supposed to put faith in church tradition anyways. So if this was a later church tradition that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, but it doesn't contradict the Bible, then it doesn't affect my belief in biblical infallibility. Although there are 3 cases, letters Timothy, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, letters claiming to be from Paul, written like, "Hello, I'm Paul, I'm writing to you, Timothy," which were not by Paul, for a variety of reasons. Scholars, I don't want to get into all the reasons right now. I've got a number of things to get through in this video, so that's an issue. But it also calls into question of where these stories come from. If they're not the eyewitness testimony of the apostles, then where do they come from? How reliable are they? And the answer is we don't know. Were they written by, do these stories come from eyewitness testimony that later got filtered down through oral tradition, or how much invention is going on here? I mean, you really have no idea. The only reason you know that they're true is because the church has told you. The church has said, look, the Bible is inspired by God. Now, how does the church know that these books are inspired by God?